Hello. Welcome to Tales from the House. Today, the 25th of April. Two stories for you today, back in time. They're both quite nice, I think. Better than yesterday, very serious note. But today we have the publication of the first ever English novel. What is that, you say? Well, let me show you. I'll kick you off with a wondrous image. Here we are. Yes, Mr. Pierce Brosnan in the terrible, terrible movie Robinson Crusoe. Oh dear, Pierce, what are you doing? Look at that sculpted chest hair. This is when you're James Bond, for goodness sake. This is between GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. When you've done Mars Attacks and Dante's Peak, you're at your height of your powers and you do this to yourself. Terrible. In any case, published today, 1719, the first English novel. You may dispute this, but let you hear my argument. It's Robinson Crusoe, written by Daniel Defoe and published today, 1719. This is Daniel Defoe, who had written other books as well. We'll come to those shortly. But this is Robinson Crusoe. To give it its full title, and you'll have to excuse me here a moment, it's quite long, in case you can't see that. The Life and Strange Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York, mariner, who lived 8 years and 20 all alone in an uninhabited island on the coast of America near the mouth of the great river Orinoco, having been cast ashore by shipwreck, wherein all the men perished but himself. With an account of how he was at last so strangely delivered by pirates. Wow, snappy title. We call it Robinson Crusoe, and thank the Lord we do. It's based loosely on the life of this man, Alexander Selkirk, who really was shipwrecked. He was a privateer who ended up shipwrecked on one of the Juan Fernandez Islands off the coast of Chile for 4.5 years. Here, in the middle of the Pacific, near nowhere, is a couple of the Juan Fernandez Islands. You can see that today, subsequently, after all of this, one of them has been named Alexander Selkirk and the other Robinson Crusoe Island. Marvelous. There we are. Oh, we can just see Chile looming in here, about 300 kilometers off the coast. So tough stuff. But there we are. So how did he end up there? Well, he was on a privateer, and in case you're not sure, a privateer is pretty much a state-sponsored pirate ship. So what would happen is the British government would allow them to use their ports, and they would sort of not interfere with them, provided they only pirated other nations' ships, and they gave a proportion of the booty as a tax to the British government. So they were British privateers. As such, they were not in South America, mostly Spanish, going to go anywhere near Spanish territory. So the ship stopped at these deserted, uninhabited Juan Fernandez Islands to take on and get some supplies. At which point, Alexander Selkirk said, I'm not getting back on that ship until we've completed repairs. The ship is going to sink, it's going to founder, and we need to do repairs. And the captain said, oh, shut up, we're getting on our way, no more of this. And Alexander Selkirk threw his toys out the pram and said, I'm not getting on there, I'd rather stay on this island. At which the captain said, fine, you can stay. Here is a knife, a gun, a pot, some clothes, some bedding, and a Bible. Off you go. And started to row away. At which point Alexander Selkirk had a swift change of mind. Thought, no, please take me with you. The captain said, no, you're trouble stuff. You know, I've given you what you need. That's what you want to get lost. You're not coming back on board my ship. You made your choice. That's pretty mean. And then sailed off. And that's Alexander Selkirk, abandoned on an uninhabited isle. Wow, amazing stuff. But he may have made the right choice, because the ship did indeed founder off the coast of Colombia not long after this. And several of the sailors died. Those who survived were captured by the Spanish and taken as prisoners because they were pirates, and were thrown into jail in Lima in Peru in terrible conditions for several years. So perhaps not so bad. He cannot possibly have imagined that he would be on this island for 4.5 years, and when that time went by, he probably started to imagine that he might not even be rescued. But he did pretty well there. He was discovered twice, actually, but unfortunately for him, it was twice by Spanish ships, and he hid and dared not reveal himself, because if he were captured, they would have executed him for being a privateer. So he had to hide from them. How frustrating that must have been. Anyway, eventually, after 4.5 years, another British privateer ended up stopping at the island, and he was so delighted and so excited he couldn't be understood at first. Not that he'd lost the will to speak, because he spoke to all sorts of things, but then he was just overcome with excitement. He babbled too much, and he was just overjoyed, and that's what's recorded as him. And you can see him here on the right, sat down in the boat as the boat comes ashore, dressed with his hat and some sort of bandolier. There he is, 4.5 years later. Well, he came back to England, and this story was the talk of the nation. No one had seen anything like it, and it was in all of the pamphlets and all of the newspapers. And this is where Daniel Defoe gets the idea from. Now, it is not clear if Defoe ever met Selkirk, and he probably didn't, but that is of no consequence. The point about this is that the story was famous across the nation and in all the papers, and it clearly inspired Defoe. Now, his character, Robinson Crusoe, lives on an island for 28 years and has a deal of other adventures as well, if you haven't read the story. And initially, Daniel Defoe didn't put his name on it. It was listed as being written by the author itself, and I think if I go back here, you can probably see that down in the middle there, above the third edition, written by himself. Well, obviously, this was not the case. So, some sort of mystery there. But is it the first novel? And I might hear some conjecture out there, because some people would point to the story of the death of Arthur, Le Mort d'Arthur, written by Malory in 1485. A good deal of time before 1719. You might even want to say, close to that, Orinoco, the story of a slave captured who was actually royalty, published by Aphra Behn in 1688. Both of these clearly very popular books before Robinson Crusoe. You could even talk about Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales, although a complete version does not exist. Well, I'm going to say no to these things, because they were published for a different purpose to Robinson Crusoe. These were instructive books, and they were true accounts, and they were portrayed as records of things. Whereas Robinson Crusoe had an entirely different purpose. Robinson Crusoe was an absolutely fictitious story, unlike these other ones, although obviously the story of Arthur is, but it was not presented as such. It was presented as a record, as a history. But this is an entirely fictional story, and that makes a difference. Previously, books had been published by the author, but this became a publishing phenomenon. It was exciting. It was entertaining. It had been a fashionable choice. Because it was all over the news and everybody was talking about it, Defoe just thought, well, people will buy a book about this kind of thing. And that's the point. This book was entirely fictionalized and was written with the express purpose, with the intent of making money. And that is what sets it aside from the other books, which are not published to make money. They're published as records and as instruction. This is an entire fiction. This is a novel with the purpose to entertain, the choice of the day, to make money. It is the first example of the book as a product. And that is why we regard it, I think, as the very first ever English novel. How did it do? Well, it was a smash hit. It went through 4 editions of publishing in its first year, and it spawned an entire genre. By the end of the 1700s, it had become the most printed and published book in English history. That's an incredible achievement. And if you haven't read it, then for the sake of cultural capital, you probably should go to. It spawned an entire genre. Any story that we have about people being isolated or desert island, it's all classed as Robinsonade. So it's got its own genre that it spawned. It spawned parodies. We had, shortly afterwards, Gulliver's Travels with Jonathan Swift, a parody of the shipwrecked seaman of Robinson Crusoe. There's satire in there as well, but clearly the basis is Robinson Crusoe. It doesn't get written in the style it is unless Robinson Crusoe is before it. And because it was so popular, Swift thought his satire would be popular and he could do a lot with it if he took it in the same way. Amazing. It's only a few years ago that this pile of tripe won the Booker Award. Consider this. Now, I've read the book. I quite enjoyed it. But does it deserve to win the Booker? No. This is basically a cheap version of Robinson Crusoe rehashed. And this is a Booker winner? I think not. Although I did enjoy it. Far better to look to the likes of J.G. Ballard, who takes Crusoeism, this idea of the abandonment, and puts it in reverse. His books are often about inverted Crusoeism, where instead of being isolated by people, the individuals often in Ballard's novels choose to isolate themselves within the middle of society. So this book here is a classic example, High Rise, where they're all living together, crammed in this big building, and people, become savage and isolate themselves from others. And Ballard's books are full of that sort of thing, so I highly recommend it. This inverted Crusoeism. And it spawned a great deal of films. This tripe here, good Lord, we had enough of that ball, didn't we? And I think that's probably Tom Hanks's least popular moment. But then there was this glory here. If you're as my age, who can fail to remember Brooke Shields in The Blue Lagoon? And we also have the wonderful Oliver Reed in Castaway, which was actually a true story of an Englishman who applied put an advert in a newspaper for a woman to join him as a castaway. And he went and tried to sort of be a castaway and recreate that Robinson Crusoe effect with, some strange consequences. A decent film, average, worth watching, simply for the history of the value. So there we are. Robinson Crusoe, the first English novel, spawned an entire genre of films, TV programs, A Swiss Family Robinson. You could go on. There's loads and loads of them, and even a recent Booker winner, to my amazement. Well, if this book is so wonderful, what would a first edition cost today? Well, if you got your hands on a first edition copy of this, then it would fetch you probably, let me say, the last time a first edition Robinson Crusoe came up for sale was in New York in 2004, and it fetched $153,000. A first edition Robinson Crusoe today from 1719 would probably therefore fetch somewhere close to $200,000. And if there's going to be a financial crisis, you're probably better off investing in that. But I know that none of us have any of that sort of money. Still, there you go. Nice little story. The first English novel published today in 1719. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Go take a look in lockdown. I'm going to bring us to the second point today, which is another piece of writing. Because today in 1983, the German magazine Stern produced this headline on its magazine: the discovery of Hitler's diaries from the pre-war period all the way through the war. Wow, that captured global headlines. That was amazing. Bought from an antiques dealer, Konrad Kujau. This man here, an antiques dealer from Stuttgart, had purchased them in Eastern Germany, realized what they were and that they were validated, and sold them to Stern magazine for £3.7 million. They were 60 volumes of this book, and they purported to be the story, the personal diaries of Adolf Hitler, from pre-war, like I said, Munich Agreement and all of that, all the way through to the end of his life. The things it said were incredible, and what a headline this made. The story goes that all 60 volumes with official documentation had been put into a plane to leave and fly and keep a record. And the plane had crashed in Eastern Germany, and the books had been rescued. How did they know they were there? Because of some documentation and because of the books themselves. Well, obviously these books end up being examined, but it was today that these books, and here are the 60 volumes with Hitler's embossed lettering on the front of them, AH, in the old Gothic German lettering, and published today, 1983, by Stern magazine, who also sold the rights globally, including to the Sunday Times, for £1 million. And they were published on the same day, today, 1983. Well, how do we know they're real? The story is really rather nice, but we know they're real because this man here, famed historian Hugh Trevor Roper, had verified them. And this was no no minor historian. He had written extensively about Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. He'd written about the Enlightenment, about Kim Philby and the Cambridge spy ring. He'd written about the Reformation and the Revolution, and he'd also done books like this, Hitler's Table Talk. I haven't read it, but it sounds mildly entertaining. Stuff that was discussed and recorded at dinners with Hitler, I think. So this is a renowned historian who's publishing these books, who has verified this. And it goes that he was so excited by the mountain of material, 60 volumes of Hitler's diaries, that he accepted Stern magazine's suggestion or acknowledgement that the paper had all been chemically tested and dated, and therefore he himself was happy to internationally authenticate these diaries as real. But no sooner than they were published than things started to go wrong. For example, people started to question what was happening, and there was no source. And as any good historian knows, you have to have some sort of provenance. Where did they come from? The story of the crash isn't good enough. Who did Konrad Kluge get them from? This has got to be verified. There has to be some documentation about this. So people started to question that. And then in Germany, they have very firm laws about the Nazis. So it is illegal to spread Nazi propaganda. And Stern magazine, in publishing the diaries, was potentially spreading Nazi propaganda. So there was a threat of a crime and prosecution to the editors and the owners of Stern magazine. They then said, well, no, this is historical. So they submitted 3 of the 60 volumes to the German government to be examined. The German government quickly discovered that they were a fake because Hitler's signature was not accurate. Equally, the paper was discovered to be post-war, and those embossed letters, they turn out to be the wrong letters. Konrad Kluge had misread them. They say FH instead of AH. I mean, the fact that people, and Hugh Trevor Roper didn't notice these things, show how excited he was by the discovery that he simply overlooked them. He wanted, as so often people do, he wanted to believe that this amazing haul was real. But it gets worse than that. There are references in the diaries to facts that Hitler could not have known because they hadn't been worked through, they hadn't been reported or collated by this point in time. And so they couldn't have been known by Hitler to have been recorded. So, I mean, it's a pretty average effort at a forgery. In fact, the paper, when chemically tested, not only proved to be post-war, but the bindings that they came in had been aged, fake aged, with tea bags. Do you remember when you were at school and you were 11 and they asked you to make the Magna Carta or some medieval document and to make it look old with tea bags? You thought that's a load of rubbish. No! This guy got $3.7 million out of being really good at Year 7 history. So don't ever say that that's not worth it again. You'd be surprised what you can learn in school and how it comes into use. So it was quickly then exposed as a hoax. And here's the Newsweek headline from some weeks after today in 1983, showing it to be a hoax, about 3 or 4 weeks later. The fallout from this was terrific. The editorial team and reporters of both Stern magazine and the Sunday Times were sacked. Murdoch tried in vain to get his money back, the £1 million that he'd got for it. Konrad Kluge was jailed for 4.5 years for fraud in the end. And I love this. He signed his confession. He wrote a confession about, yes, how it was a fake and a forgery. He wrote his confession in Hitler's style handwriting. And I just think that's really rather wonderful, tongue-in-cheek stuff. Robert Harris subsequently made a best-selling book about the entire affair, which is marvelous and well worth reading. And that was the end of the Hitler Diaries. So momentous, and yet what a terrible, terrible failure. But the story of the failure itself is wonderful, isn't it, today in 1983? And whatever happened to Konrad Kluge? Well, you know, this guy who wrote his own confession in the style of Hitler, never lost his sense of humor. When he got out of jail, he decided, because he had been a pretty awful forged painter as well, he decided to go back to forging paintings. And he opened a gallery where he forged Dali's and Monet's, and he put the forged signatures on, and he also put his on. So they were kind of like, he called them genuine forgeries and sold them openly as, this is a forgery, but isn't it rather good? And because the man was famous, they sold for tens of thousands of pounds. And then things just get even more meta, because on the market, there started to appear forgeries of his genuine forgeries, the forger of the Hitler Diaries. And that's just too many steps and levels of meta. So I think I'm going to end it there. But what a wonderful story that is. There you go. 2 events today. 1719, the publication of the first English novel, Robinson Crusoe, and 1983, the publication of the Hitler Diaries, which turned out to be fake. That's your lot for today. Please remember to subscribe down here and over here for yesterday, the Easter Rising, and the very great Ernest Shackleton. I'll see you all later for another episode tomorrow for the 26th of April. You take care. Hope you enjoyed that.